The sun was a relentless furnace in the vast expanse of the Texas plains, beating down on the cracked earth. The dust was a living thing, swirling around Elara's ragged boots, coating her hair and stinging her eyes. Her stomach ached with a hollow, gnawing pain that had become her constant companion. It had been 3 days since she'd eaten anything more than a few foraged berries, and even those were a distant memory. She clutched a small, worn satchel to her chest, the only remnant of a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away. The town of redemption was a mirage on the horizon, a collection of ramshackle wooden buildings that promised water, food, and perhaps a sliver of hope. With each weary step, the town seemed to recede, a cruel trick of the heat. Elara's mind drifted back to the journey, the series of misfortunes that had led her to this desperate state. Her family, her home, all gone. She was a ghost walking in a land of the living, her past a heavy anchor dragging her down. As she stumbled into the town, the air was thick with the scent of horse manure, stale whiskey, and the faint, tantalizing smell of cooked meat. Her knees buckled. A group of rough-looking men at the saloon entrance jeered, their laughter a harsh, mocking sound. She ignored them, her gaze fixed on the general store. A sign promised provisions. Inside, the shelves were sparsely stocked. A burly man with a thick moustache stood behind the counter, his eyes a cold calculation. "Water? Food?" she rasped, her voice hoarse. He smirked, leaning on the counter. "What you got to trade, little lady? We don't take promises here." Elara's hand tightened on the satchel. A single tarnished locket was all she had left, but it was her mother's. She couldn't. Her eyes scanned the room, desperate. Her gaze fell upon a loaf of bread, fresh and golden, sitting on a nearby shelf. The sight of it made her dizzy. A wave of shame washed over her, but the hunger was a more powerful tide. I have nothing to trade," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I can work. I'll do anything. She trailed off, her eyes meeting his. He understood. His smirk widened, and his gaze lingered on her body. "Anything?" The humiliation was a fire in her cheeks. The weight of her situation crashed down on her. She had come to this. A sob caught in her throat. She nodded, a single, agonizing jerk of her head. A sudden commotion at the store's entrance cut through the tense silence. A tall, broad-shouldered man entered, his frame filling the doorway. He was dressed in worn but clean work clothes, his face tanned and weathered, a canvas of hard living. A little girl, no older than 5, clung to his hand. Her bright, inquisitive eyes scanned the store, then landed on Elara. The man, Elias, noticed the scene immediately. The store owner's leering expression, Elara's posture of utter defeat. He saw the desperation in her eyes, the shame burning there. His own face remained impassive, but his eyes, a clear blue, held a flicker of something she couldn't name. He bought his supplies, his daughter chattering excitedly about a new doll in the window. As he turned to leave, the little girl, Lily, tugged at his coat. "Papa, look," she said, pointing a tiny finger at Elara. "Why is she sad?" Elias knelt down, his voice gentle. "I don't know, honey. Come on, we need to get back to the ranch." But Lily didn't move. She walked up to Elara, her small hand reaching out. "You're hungry, aren't you?" she said, her voice full of a child's simple, direct empathy. Tears welled in Elara's eyes. She nodded, unable to speak. Lily turned back to her father. "Papa, can we give her some bread? She looks like she's going to fall over." Elias hesitated. The store owner watched, a sneer on his face. Elias's gaze met Elara's again. The raw need in her eyes was unmistakable. He bought the loaf of bread she had been staring at and a small flask of water. He handed them to her, not a word exchanged. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. As he turned to leave, Lily spoke again, her words innocent but powerful. "Papa," she said, her voice clear as a bell. "She looks like she needs a home. She can be my mother instead." The store owner snorted, a laugh rumbling in his chest, but Elias froze, the words hanging in the air. He looked from his daughter to Elara, then back to Lily. It was a bizarre, unexpected request. He knew the child didn't understand the complexities of life, but her plea touched a part of him he kept guarded. He knelt, taking his daughter's hand. He looked at Elara, a woman he had never seen before, and offered a new kind of trade, a chance at redemption. The journey to Elias's ranch was a quiet one. Elara sat in the back of the wagon, clutching the bread and water flask. Lily, perched on the seat beside her father, kept glancing back, her curious gaze a balm to Elara's raw nerves. Elias drove with a focused intensity, his eyes on the horizon. The silence was heavy, but it wasn't hostile. It was the silence of two strangers, bound by a child's simple act of kindness. As they rode, the sun dipped lower, casting long, golden shadows across the plains. The air began to cool, and a gentle breeze offered some relief from the day's heat. The rhythmic creak of the wagon wheels and the soft thud of the horses' hooves were the only sounds. Elara took a small bite of the bread. It was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted. She savored each morsel, feeling a slow warmth spread through her body. They arrived at the ranch just as the last light was fading. The homestead was modest but sturdy, a two-story log house, a large barn, and several corrals. The smell of wood smoke hung in the air, a scent of home that brought a fresh wave of tears to Elara's eyes. It was a stark contrast to the desolate life she had been living. Elias helped Lily down from the wagon, then turned to Elara. "You can come in," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "There's a fire and the night air gets cold." Elara hesitated, a flicker of doubt in her eyes. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his expression unreadable in the twilight. "Lily asked me to," he said simply, "and I didn't like what I saw back there. No one should be that desperate." His words, honest and without pretense, disarmed her. She slid down from the wagon, her legs shaky. Inside, the house was warm and smelled of stew. A fire crackled in the stone hearth. Lily ran to a woman sitting by the fire, a kind-faced older woman with greying hair pulled into a neat bun. "Nonna!" Lily exclaimed. "Papa brought a new friend." The woman, Nonna, smiled warmly. "And who is this?" she asked, her eyes gentle as she took in Elara's worn clothes and exhausted demeanor. "This is Elara," Elias said, introducing them. "She'll be helping around the ranch for a while." Elara felt the weight of her lie, helping. It was a more dignified way of saying what she was, a charity case, but she accepted the name, the purpose. Nonna offered her a bowl of thick stew, which she devoured ravenously. She was given a small room, clean and simple, with a warm bed. As she lay down, the day's events replayed in her mind. A child's simple request had saved her. A rancher's quiet compassion had offered her a safe harbor. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in a long time, she felt a flicker of hope. The morning sun streamed through the window, waking Elara from the deepest, most peaceful sleep she had had in months. She rose early, a quiet determination settling over her. She would work, and she would prove her worth. The ranch was a hub of activity. Nonna was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast, and the smell of sizzling bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. Elias was outside, his voice a low rumble, as he gave instructions to a couple of hands. Elara found Nonna and asked what she could do. "First, you eat," Nonna said, her smile gentle. "Then you can help me with the laundry and the garden." The work was hard, but it was honest. Elara washed clothes in a big metal tub, scrubbing them clean with a bar of lye soap. Her hands, soft from a life that had been far different, quickly grew red and raw. But she worked without complaint. She hoed the rows of vegetables, weeding with a practiced ease she didn't know she had. It was simple, physical labor, but it was a release. It was a way to ground herself in the present, to silence the ghosts of her past. In the afternoons, she would sit with Lily, teaching her simple songs and stories. Lily was a bright, curious child, and her laughter was a melody that filled the house. She would often climb into Elara's lap, her small arms wrapped around her neck. "You're a good storyteller," Lily would say, her eyes wide with admiration. Elias would watch these interactions from a distance, his expression a mixture of curiosity and caution. He was a man of few words, his actions speaking louder than any speech. He was fair, but he was also a hard man. He expected a day's work for a day's pay, and he didn't suffer fools. He had taken a gamble on Elara, and he was watching to see if it would pay off. One evening, as they sat around the dinner table, a storm began to brew outside. The wind howled and rain lashed against the windows. The conversation was easy, but Elias's eyes were on Elara. "What brought you to redemption?" he asked, his voice low. Elara's heart hammered in her chest. She had a story prepared, a simple lie about her family losing their farm. It was a half-truth, but it felt like a betrayal. She looked at Nonna, at Lily, and then at Elias, whose gaze was unwavering. She knew she couldn't lie to him. She took a deep breath. "It's a long story," she began, her voice barely a whisper, "and it's not a happy one." He nodded, a silent acknowledgement. "I can see that," he said, "but you're safe here now. As long as you work hard and don't cause trouble, you have a place." It was a contract, a deal of sorts. She was not a guest. She was a member of the household. The boundaries were clear. She was a woman who had offered her body for bread, and she was now a hired hand. The arrangement was transactional, but under the surface, a fragile sense of trust was beginning to form. The weeks turned into months, and Elara's hands grew calloused, her skin tanned by the sun. She became a fixture on the ranch, a quiet and dependable presence. She learned the rhythms of the land, the signs of a coming storm, the best way to mend a fence. She found a quiet solace in the simple, repetitive nature of the work. It kept her mind from wandering to the dark corners of her past, but the past was never far. In the dead of night, she would wake from nightmares, her body slick with cold sweat. Images of the journey, the hunger, the cruelty of men, and the faces of her lost family would flash through her mind. She would sit up in bed, a hand pressed to her mouth to stifle a sob, and she would watch the moon through her window, a lone sentinel in the vast, empty sky. Elias noticed her silent suffering. One morning, he found her in the barn, her shoulders shaking, a single tear tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. He didn't speak. He simply stood there, a silent, solid presence. When she looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of shame and surprise, he spoke. "The past is a heavy burden," he said, his voice softer than she had ever heard it, "but it's not a life sentence." She looked at him, her heart aching with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. He didn't pry. He didn't ask her to share her story. He simply offered a quiet understanding. Their interactions began to change. They were no longer just boss and employee. They would share a cup of coffee on the porch in the mornings, talking about the weather, the livestock, the simple details of ranch life. Elara found herself opening up, telling him about her dreams, her hopes for a future that seemed, for so long, impossible. One afternoon, as they were mending a fence, Elias told her about his late wife, Clara. She had died in a fever just a year after Lily was born. His voice was laced with a quiet grief that spoke of a deep and abiding love. He spoke of Clara's kindness, her laughter, and her love for the ranch. He didn't talk about his pain, but it was there, in the lines around his eyes, in the quiet way he spoke her name. It was an exchange of stories, a silent acknowledgement of shared sorrow. It wasn't a conversation about their pasts, but an unspoken agreement that they were both wounded, both surviving. Elara began to see him not as a gruff, detached man, but as a man who had loved and lost, a man who was quietly, bravely carrying his own burden. The silence between them was no longer heavy with unspoken questions. It was filled with a growing sense of trust and a burgeoning, unspoken understanding. The ranch had become more than just a place to live for Elara. It was a home. The routines of daily life provided a sense of stability she hadn't felt in years. She had found her place, not just as a hired hand, but as a part of the family. Lily had become her shadow. The little girl would follow her everywhere, a constant source of joy and laughter. She would sit on a hay bale while Elara mended a saddle, or help her pick vegetables from the garden, her small hands clumsy but eager. Lily's love was uncomplicated and unconditional. "You feel like my mother," she said one day, her small hand in Elara's. The words, once a desperate plea, were now a simple statement of fact. Elara's heart swelled with an emotion she couldn't name. It was a mix of love, hope, and a deep, profound sense of gratitude. She had not forgotten her past, but it no longer defined her. She was healing, and the process was messy and slow, but it was real. Nonna, too, had become a confidant and a friend. The older woman taught her how to bake bread, to make jams from wild berries, and to tell the difference between a good cow and a bad one. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, their hands busy with mending or quilting, and Nonna would share stories of her life, of the hardships and the joys of the West. She had a wisdom that came from a life well lived, and she saw through Elara's quiet demeanor to the strength that lay beneath. Elias watched this new dynamic with a sense of quiet wonder. He saw a change in Lily, a newfound happiness. He saw the way Elara held his daughter, a tenderness in her eyes that reminded him of Clara. He saw her work ethic, her quiet determination, and her resilience. He had offered a place, a roof and food, but she had given them so much more. She had brought life back into their house, a warmth and a joy that had been missing since Clara's passing. His feelings for her began to shift. The initial cautiousness gave way to a grudging respect, and then to something more. He found himself looking for her in the yard, his heart giving a small jolt when he saw her. He began to linger in the kitchen, inventing reasons to talk to her. It was a slow, tentative courtship, a dance of two people who had been broken by life but were learning to trust again. It was a fragile thing, but it was real. It was a different kind of family, not bound by blood, but by a shared history of pain and a growing sense of mutual respect and affection. The peace of the ranch was shattered one cool autumn afternoon. Elara was in the barn, stacking bales of hay, when a rider approached the homestead. It was a man from town, one of the rough-looking types from the saloon. His name was Jed, and he had a reputation for being a bully. Jed rode up to the barn, his horse's hooves kicking up dust. He dismounted with a swagger, a smug look on his face. "Well, well," he said, his eyes raking over Elara's body. "Look what we have here. The little charity case. I heard you found a new way to pay for your keep." Elara's blood ran cold. The past, the shame, all of it came flooding back. She ignored him, her hands trembling as she continued to work. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Don't pretend you don't know me. I remember you in the store, offering anything for a loaf of bread. A desperate little thing, weren't you?" Elara kept her back to him, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel his eyes on her, feel his malice. "Leave me alone," she said, her voice low and tight. "Or what?" he sneered, taking a step closer. "You gonna tell your new boss, the great Elias?" At that moment, Elias walked out of the house. He saw Jed's posture, the look on Elara's face. He knew instinctively that something was wrong. His hands tightened into fists. "What's going on here, Jed?" he asked, his voice low and dangerous. Jed turned, a sneer still on his face. "Just catching up with your new hire, Elias. Seems she's got a past she'd rather not talk about." Elias's gaze shifted from Jed to Elara. She stood stiffly, her eyes fixed on the ground, her face pale. He saw the shame there, the fear. He knew what Jed was implying. He had known from the moment he had seen her in the store that she was desperate. But what he saw now was not a desperate woman. It was a woman who was a part of his family. "I don't know what you're talking about," Elias said, his voice flat. "Elara's a hard worker and a good woman. Now you get on your horse and you get off my land." Jed's smirk faltered. He had expected a fight, not a cold, calm dismissal. "She's a tramp," he spat. "She was ready to sell herself for a piece of bread." The words were a physical blow. Elara flinched, her shoulders slumping. Elias's eyes, a clear blue, turned to ice. "The only tramp here is you, Jed," he said, his voice a low growl. "You're trespassing, and if you don't leave now, I'll put a bullet in you." Jed stared at him for a long moment, then spat on the ground and mounted his horse. He rode away, but his laughter echoed back, a promise of more trouble to come. Elias walked over to Elara. He didn't touch her, but his presence was a solid comfort. "Don't you listen to him," he said, his voice firm. "He's just a bitter, lonely man." Elara looked up, her eyes filled with tears. "You believe him, don't you?" she whispered. I believe what I see," he said, his voice unwavering. "I see a woman who is trying to build a new life for herself. I see a woman who has a good heart and a kind soul. The past is the past, Elara. It doesn't define you." His words, simple and direct, were a gift. He had not judged her. He had seen her for who she was, not who she had been. He had defended her, not because she was a woman, but because she was a part of his home. She had been saved from a desperate life, but now she was being saved from her past. Word spread through town like wildfire. Jed, humiliated and angry, had a talent for gossip. Soon, whispers followed Elara whenever she went to redemption. The town's women, who had once been polite, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and contempt. They would pull their children closer, their eyes full of judgment. Elara felt the weight of their scrutiny. She had been so careful, so quiet. She had thought she was safe. But the past was a persistent shadow, and it had found her. She was not a part of their world. She was the woman who had offered her body for bread. The rumors were a constant nagging pain. She began to stay on the ranch, avoiding town. The peace she had found was now tinged with a fragile uncertainty. Elias saw her withdrawal. He knew the source of her pain. One evening he found her sitting on the porch, her hands idle in her lap. "You can't let them win," he said, his voice soft. "Their opinions don't matter." "It's easy for you to say," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You've always been respected here. I'm just a stranger." "You're not a stranger," he said, his voice firm. "You're family, and we don't let our family get hurt." He took her to town the next day. He walked with her, his presence a shield against the judgmental stares. He held his head high, and he spoke to people, his voice a quiet challenge to their gossip. He bought supplies, and he made sure to be seen with her. He was showing the town that he stood with her. He was saying, without a single word, that she was his, and they would not hurt her. That evening, as they were eating dinner, Nonna spoke. "The world is full of cruel people, Elara," she said, her eyes wise. "But it is also full of kind ones. You have us. That's what matters." Elara looked at Nonna, at Elias, at Lily, who was busy drawing a picture of a horse. This was her family. This was her home. The town's judgment stung, but it was nothing compared to the warmth and love that surrounded her on the ranch. She would not let their whispers drive her away. She would stay, and she would fight for her new life. She would face the past, and she would win. Jed's gossip was not enough to satisfy his spite. A few weeks later, a group of Elias's cattle went missing. It was a serious blow. The winter was approaching, and they needed every head of cattle to survive. Elias and his men searched for days, but there was no sign of the herd. Elias's neighbor, a man named Sam, was a rival. He had a history of trying to buy Elias's land, and their relationship was strained. Elias suspected him, but he had no proof. Elara knew the truth. She had heard Jed bragging in town that he had rustled the cattle to hurt Elias. She knew he had done it out of revenge, but she also knew the man was dangerous. If she told Elias Jed could come after her, she had a new life, a family she loved. She didn't want to risk it. She wrestled with the decision. Silence would protect her, but it would harm the people who had saved her. Lying by omission felt just as wrong as a direct lie. The memory of Elias's words, "The past doesn't define you," echoed in her mind. He had trusted her, and now she had to trust him. She found him in the barn, his face grim, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "I know who took the cattle," she said, her voice shaking. He looked at her, his eyes full of exhaustion. "Who?" "Jed," she said, the name a painful admission. "He was bragging about it. He said he did it to get back at you for standing up for me." Elias's jaw tightened. "Did you hear him yourself?" She nodded. "In town. He didn't know I was there." He was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. He looked at her, his eyes full of a mixture of anger and concern. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "I was afraid," she whispered. "He's dangerous. I didn't want to bring trouble to your home, to Lily." He understood. He knelt down, his gaze level with hers. "You did the right thing, Elara. You chose to protect us, even if it meant putting yourself at risk. That's a brave thing to do." He gathered his men, and they rode out. Elara watched them go, her heart pounding. She had made a choice, a difficult one. She had chosen loyalty over fear. She had chosen to be a part of this family, to be a person of worth and character. Her past was a scar, but her present was a testament to her strength. The men returned that evening, a small herd of cattle in tow. The air was thick with tension. They had confronted Jed, and a fight had ensued. Elias was fine, but a few of his men had been hurt. The cattle were not all there, but it was a start. Elias looked tired and grim, but there was a light of victory in his eyes. Jed, now officially branded a rustler, was a man on the run, but his threat was still present. Elias knew he wouldn't stay away forever. The law in the West was a fickle thing, and they had to be prepared. The winter set in, and the world was covered in a blanket of white. The ranch became a fortress against the cold. The family huddled together, sharing stories, playing games, and working to prepare for the long months ahead. One evening, as Elias and Elara sat by the fire, Lily sleeping soundly in her arms, he spoke. "You saved us, you know," he said, his voice low. "If you hadn't told me about Jed, we would have lost everything." "You saved me first," she whispered, her eyes on the dancing flames. "You and Lily. You gave me a home. You gave me a family." He reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm and comforting. "It's a two-way street, Elara. We're in this together." Their relationship had been a slow, quiet burn. It had been built on shared hardship, mutual respect, and a deep-seated affection. They had both been broken, and they had both found a way to heal together. He had seen past her shame, and she had seen past his grief. They were two halves of a whole, finding completion in each other. The fire crackled, casting long shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled, a lonely sound, But inside they were safe. Inside they were home. The storm was coming, but they were ready for it. They were a family, and they would face whatever came their way, together. The spring came, and with it a new sense of hope. The snow melted, and the land was reborn in a burst of green and gold. The ranch was thriving. Elias had bought more cattle, and the herd was growing. The threats from Jed had subsided. He had moved on, and the town was slowly forgetting the rumors. Elara's life was full. She was a mother to Lily, a partner to Elias, and a vital part of the ranch. The past was no longer a shadow but a memory, a part of her story that had led her to this place. She was a testament to the power of human connection, the resilience of the human spirit, and the simple, profound power of kindness. One clear morning, as the sun rose over the hills, Elias found her by the corrals, her hair glinting in the light. He walked up to her, his heart full. "Elara," he said, his voice soft. She turned to him, a smile on her face. "Elias." He took her hand, his thumb stroking her palm. "I want to ask you something." She looked at him, her eyes wide with anticipation. "Lily asked for a mother," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "And she found one. I'm asking for a wife. I'm asking you to be a part of our family, not just for now, but for always. I want to build a life with you." Tears welled in her eyes. It was a question she had been waiting for, a promise she had been hoping for. She had offered her body for bread, and she had been given a home, a family, and a love she had never thought possible. "Yes," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Elias. 1,000 times, yes." They stood there holding hands, the vast expanse of the west stretching out before them. The land was still wild and untamed, and life would still be hard, but they were together. They were no longer two lonely, broken people. They were a family, united by love, by resilience, and by a shared belief in a better tomorrow. The dust of the past was finally settling, and in its place a beautiful new beginning was taking root.